Hello there, and welcome. My name is Alexander, and you're listening to Another Realization. We are often taught that democracy is the quintessence of human civilization, that our vote is our voice, and many people even use democracy and freedom interchangeably. But is democracy really the same as freedom? So what exactly is democracy? Democracy implies a form of government in which the people have the authority to deliberate and decide on legislation, or to choose governing officials to do so. Now, let us discuss the meaning of government and authority. There are two basic ways in which people interact with each other: by mutual agreements, or by one person using threats or violence to force his will upon another. The first can be labeled consent. Consent is when both sides willingly and voluntarily agree to what is to be done. The second can be labeled governing, one person controlling another. One of the fundamental ideas we are taught about government is the concept of the consent of the governed. And based on how we have juxtaposed the words consent and govern, this concept is a literal paradox. If there is mutual consent, then it is not government. And if there is governing, the use of threats or violence to force one's will upon another, then there is no consent. Consent is a prerequisite of freedom. There can be no freedom without consent. Because if there is no consent, if it isn't voluntary, then it is involuntary, which implies coercion and imposition. And to be coerced and imposed upon is not to be free, but to be governed by someone else. Any government that has the consent of its subjects would not need and would not have law enforcers. Enforcement, meaning to enforce something on someone else, happens only if someone does not consent to something. And if we are honest with ourselves, we all know that government does things to a lot of people against their will on a regular basis. If there really was consent, there would be no need for tax collectors, cops, regulators, border guards, narcotics agents, prosecutors, judges, soldiers, or any other mercenaries of the state. In fact, one has to lie to oneself in order to claim that government does what it does with the so-called consent of the governed. The truth is that government is never based on consent. Even when you say that you agree that someone may control you and make decisions about your life, the moment the controller must force you to do something, there is obviously no consent. So to accept the concept of government is basically to say, I agree to let you force things upon me, whether I agree to them or not. Now, is that actually what you think? To most people listening, this has become quite apparent since the last 2 years, that government does things to a lot of people against their will and without their consent. But with the most obvious out of the way, with true consent being a mutual agreement, where both sides willingly and voluntarily agree to what is to be done, some people will still claim that a majority can give consent for something to be done to someone else. That is similar to when I say that I give my consent for someone else to be robbed, that it's therefore okay that he gets robbed, because I agree to it, but he didn't. However, this is obviously not what consent means. No one, individually or as a group, can give their consent for something to be done to someone else. Yet that is the basis of democracy. The idea that a majority can give consent on behalf of a minority and can impose its priorities, preferences, and values on the rest. Allow me to ask you a few simple questions. Would it be okay for me to take your money by force or steal from you? I would say that it's patently wrong to take someone else's money without their consent, but you tell me. Now, what if I would like to fund an education system? And what if I don't have enough money to create it? And suppose you have the money for it. Should you have the choice to contribute voluntarily? And if you didn't want to, should you also have the choice not to donate? So, should you be able to decide for yourself how you spend your own resources? I think that you should always have the freedom to decide for yourself whether you want to spend your own money on the endeavor I propose or not to spend your money on it. Because it's your property, not mine. But you tell me, would it be okay for me to force you to fund my education system under the threat of violence? I don't think that it's okay to do that, because as I've said earlier, it would be patently immoral for me to take your money without your consent, or steal from you, simply because you gave your time, energy, and attention in exchange for the resources you've acquired. You've given a part of your life to acquire the money that you've earned, and I can't just take it from you without your consent, especially not under the threat of violence. But hey, you tell me. Now, what if you were organizing a fundraiser to help the poor, and you asked me if I'd like to donate? Should I be allowed to decide for myself, voluntarily, whether I should donate, or should I be forced to donate under the threat of violence? If you say that I should be free to choose voluntarily, then I agree, and I thank you a lot for that. To get back to my education system that I wanted to fund, what if I decided to force you to fund my education system? Because I think it's extremely necessary, and I want my children to have a good education. And what if I wasn't the only one? But what if I and 10 others wanted to force you to fund our education system under threat of violence? Would it be okay for us to take your money from you by force? Would you agree that it's still theft, even if it's for a good cause? If you asked me, I would certainly say that it's still theft, and that it's wrong. People all have different priorities. What's important to some individuals may be less important to other individuals. Some people may not be convinced that the proposed program would be capable of achieving the stated goal. Some people prefer a different way of doing things, so there has to be consistency. There needs to be a standard where bad behavior is always wrong, even if you think it's okay, and where the end does not always justify the means, just because it works out better for you. But you tell me, now what if it isn't only 10 of us? What if there were hundreds of others who also wanted to steal your money, or even millions of others? And we were all of the opinion that it was okay to steal your money to fund whatever we wish to fund, and that it was okay to do violence unto you if you didn't let us take your money by force. Would the increase in the number of people who wanted to rob you make it right for us to steal from you? I would say that it's still wrong, because numbers don't alter morality, and bad behavior will still be bad, regardless of how many people want it to be good. But you tell me, is there any means by which a number of individuals can delegate or give away to someone else the moral right to do something that none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? So, if I don't have the right to steal, is it possible for me to give someone else the right to steal? I would say that that's not possible, because you cannot give something to someone else if you don't have it yourself. But hey, you tell me. And what if all of us, the millions of people who want to steal your money in order to fund our goals, decided to have a vote, and that we would appoint one of us as our official representative, and we all agreed? Not you, of course, because you're the person we're trying to rob. We all agreed that our representative now has the right to steal from you. Would that now make it okay for us to steal your money? I would say that it's still wrong, because hey, you cannot delegate or give away a right you don't have. If it's wrong for me to steal, then it's wrong for anybody else to steal as well. And it's not possible to give someone else the supposed right to steal when I don't have it myself. But you tell me, and what if our representative would write down on a piece of paper that he now had the right to steal from you? And if you didn't let us take your money, then he would have the right to assault you violently, kidnap you, and put you in a cage. Would the act of him writing it down on paper make it right for him to steal from you? I would say that it's still wrong, even if you write down on a piece of paper that it's okay for you to do so, because scribbles on parchment don't alter morality. But you tell me. And let's say that he doesn't call it stealing and assaulting anymore, but he decides to give those actions a different name to make it sound less obvious and direct. Let's say that he now decides to call it taxation and arresting, and he decides to call the piece of paper on which he wrote down that he has the right to steal from you the law. Would the act of changing the names of wrong behavior turn it into right behavior? I would say that it's still not okay, because altering the way you say you're going to do something bad unto someone else doesn't change the fact that you're still doing something bad. But you tell me. And let's say that all of us, the millions of people who want to steal your money to fund our goals, decided to give our representative a more official sounding title. Let's say that we decide to call him our government from now on. And whenever our representative government steals your money, taxes you to fund the goals that we wish to manifest, we would call that democracy. Would that finally make it right for us to steal from you now? And would that make it morally justified for us to threaten you, assault you, kidnap you, and put you in a cage if you didn't let us take your money? And even to go as far as to murder you if you forcibly resisted our attempts to extort you, because we expect you to just do as you're told. If not, then at which point did we decide that it was okay to vote for politicians to do exactly that, in the name of democracy? At which point did we decide that it was okay for a majority to impose their will on a minority, by way of violent coercion and thefts brought forth by the politicians, or their hired henchmen who they pay to coerce and steal violently, in the name of the people they represent? How do we go from stealing and assaulting as wrong, no matter how many people want it to be right or whatever they wish to do with the money they stole, to it's not only right for you to do so, but you're morally obligated to choose a politician who's going to impose his will and his version of tax policy on millions of others, in order to fund whatever the majority wishes to fund? At which point did you decide that a government can have the right to steal from people in the name of a piece of parchment, or because a large number of people want it to be so, or, to use the correct terminology, to tax people in the name of law and democracy? The truth is simple. Without people's consent and agreement to what is being done, it is never right to force your will upon another violently. Regardless of how many people want to do so, what political rituals they performed, the different names you decide to ascribe to the wrongful acts, or whatever they wrote down on a piece of paper. Wrong behavior stays wrong, and can never become right even when the majority wants it to be right. This is where we inevitably approach the fabrication of consent when there is none, which is also known as implied consent. The claim is that by merely living in a town or a state or a country, one is agreeing to abide by whatever rules happen to be issued by the people who claim to have the right to rule that town, state or country. The idea is that if someone does not like the rules, he is free to leave the town, state or country altogether. And if he chooses not to leave, that constitutes giving his consent to be controlled by the rulers of that jurisdiction. Now, it obviously doesn't make sense if a carjacker stops a driver on Sunday and tells him, by driving a car in this neighborhood on Sunday, you are agreeing to give me your car. One person obviously cannot decide what counts as someone else agreeing to something. An agreement is when two or more people communicate a mutual willingness to enter into some arrangements. Simply being born somewhere is not agreeing to anything, nor is living in one's own house when some king or politician has declared it to be within the realm he rules. And if somebody declares to have the right to make the rules for a particular place, he is implying that he is the owner of that place. That is the basis of property ownership, that the owner has the exclusive right to decide what is done with and on that property. The owner of a house has the right to make the rules in his own house. He can decide who may or may not enter. He can tell visitors what they can and cannot do as long as they are in the house. Like, you can come into my house only if you take your shoes off. Or, you're not allowed to smoke in my house. The owner of the house makes the rules in the house because he owns it and it's his property. This brings us back to the concept of implied consent. To tell someone that his only valid choices are either to leave the country or to abide by whatever commands the politicians issue logically implies that everything in the country is the property of the politicians. If a person can spend year after year paying for his own house or even building it himself, and his choices are still to either obey the politicians or get out, that means that his house and the time and efforts he invested in the house are the property of the politicians, because the choices are theirs to make. And if you didn't know, for one person's time and effort rightfully to belong to another is the definition of slavery. That is exactly what implied consent means. That every country is a huge slave plantation, and that everything and everyone in that country is the property of the politicians, who may decide if you're allowed to paint your house a different color or grow a tree in your garden, etc. And of course, the master does not need the consent of his slaves. The slaves need the permission of their master. Imagine a large slave plantation with thousands of slaves living under the rule of a slave master. Now, this is not your typical run-of-the-mill slave plantation. This plantation is a democracy, where the slaves are allowed to choose which slave owner will rule over them. There are also many other slave plantations that, likewise, allow their slaves to choose their masters, although some of them only have very few choices. And the aspiring slave masters who want to be elected are often very corrupt and self-serving, or will eventually become corrupt after lying to the slaves that they would work in their interests. And you might ask, how can you convince slaves that they're not slaves? Well, the slave plantation isn't actually called a slave plantation. It is called a country. And the slave masters are not called slave masters, but democratically elected representatives of the people of that country. The slaves are not referred to as slaves, but as citizens. And the whims of the slave masters or representatives are called the law. The slaves are also allowed to keep a decent amount of what they worked for, sometimes up to 70% if they are lucky. The slaves are all law-abiding citizens. Everybody who understands that they are actually slaves and try to escape or resist the slave master's control over them are called criminals. And the slaves are taught that it's wrong to disobey the slave master when he wants to do something to you or take something from you without your consent, or as they would call it, to break the law. The slave masters or representatives don't take all the fruits of what the slaves have worked for, just 30%, but the percentage may increase over time, and the representatives will often do things to the slaves that they do not like. And the slaves will frequently complain that this goes against their democracy. But the slaves are not aware of what is actually happening. The slaves hope that one day, eventually, there will be a candidate who will actually give them more freedom, and will actually care about what the slaves want, and will allow them to keep more of what they worked for. They continue to vote, hoping that their wish will one day come true. Now you may ask, is it still slavery then? Yes, it is, because it's still up to the slave master to decide how much a slave can keep of the fruits of his own labor, and it's still up to the slave master to decide how free he can be. The slave master still owns you, and you still need his permission to do anything. If your consent is not taken into account, there is no freedom. If you need someone else's permission to do something, the decision is theirs to make. And if you need the permission of the masters to be free or do anything, he owns you. But then along came the abolitionists and tried to explain to the slaves that they should stop voting for a slightly different slave master, and said that they should be free, that they owned themselves, and that only they can decide what they can spend their resources on, that the slave masters didn't have the right to do anything to them without their consent. But the slaves immediately got triggered by the very first sentence. Stop voting? Do you even realize what that would mean? That means that your vote would immediately go to the highest ranking party or representative, or that other slaves would appoint a slave master we don't like. The abolitionists asked them why they even needed a slave master in the first place, why they couldn't live their lives without a slave master telling them what to do. To this, the slaves answered, there would be chaos without slavery. I mean, who would pick the cotton? After explaining to them that the cotton can be picked without slavery, the abolitionists said that they should free themselves from the oppression by ceasing to obey the slave masters. The slaves answered deliriously, not do what the slave master tells us, but that would be breaking the law. I would never break the law. We need slave masters or representatives to tell us what we are allowed or not allowed to do, and tell us how we should live our lives. The abolitionists were bewildered by the amount of manipulation to which the slaves had been subjected. The slaves actually couldn't imagine a world without slavery. And this is something we're going to talk about later on. To come back to the concept of implied consent, it is still bewildering to me how it is that a few politicians could have acquired the right to claim exclusive ownership of thousands of square miles of land that was already occupied, as their territory, to rule and exploit as they see fit. Besides, what other option is there? To leave the proclaimed territory of the politicians, or their country, and relocate to a different one? Move to some other giant slave plantation? Well, that would imply that everyone on Earth is a slave, with the only choice being which master gets to rule you. This completely rules out actual freedom, because this has nothing to do with consent. When did you ever agree that politicians may decide what you may or may not do with your own house, and how much you may keep of the fruits of your own labor? The belief that politicians own everything is demonstrated even more dramatically in the concept of immigration laws. The idea that a human being needs permission from politicians to set foot anywhere in an entire country, and that it can be a crime for someone to step across an invisible line between one authoritarian jurisdiction into another, implies that the entire country is the property of the ruling class. If a citizen is not allowed to hire an illegal alien, is not allowed to trade with them, is not even allowed to invite an illegal alien into his own home because the politicians said so, that means that individual citizens actually own nothing, and the politicians own everything. Are you really the property of a bunch of politicians? And is it true that the only thing you can do is choose which politician may lay claim over the territory he calls a country, in the hopes that he will permit you to do things that you would normally have the right to do anyway? Or do you actually own yourself, and are the fruits of your own labor and your property solely your own? In that case, your consent should always be taken into account. So do you agree that your consent should always matter? Or can somebody just force you to do something you don't like, and threaten you with violence if you don't do what he wants you to do? Also think about that the next time you wave your flag around with pride and glory, because the flag is the symbol of the territory of a ruling class. By being a proud citizen of a country, you actually express pride in being a slave of the plantation where you happen to live. We have the idea that governments should actually work for the people and should represent the people. Let me make it clear to you that such ideas cannot and will never work, because of the inherent nature of what government actually is. If the government works for us, if it is our employee, why does it decide how much we pay it? Why does our employee decide what he will do for us? Why does our employee tell us how to live our lives? Why do our employees demand our obedience for whatever arbitrary commands they issue, sending armed enforcers after us if we disobey? It is impossible for a government ever to be the servant, because of what government is, and the rights they claim to have to use threats or violence to force their will upon others. Simply put, if someone can boss you around and take your money, he is not your servant. To imagine that a ruler could ever be the servant of those over whom he rules is ridiculous. It is tantamount to the idea that a slave master works for his slaves. Of course, one master may whip his slaves less severely than another. One master may allow his slaves to keep more of what they produce. One master may take better care of his slaves, but none of that changes the basic underlying nature of the slave-master relationship. The one with the right to rule is the master. The one with the obligation to obey is the slave. And that is true even when people choose to describe the situation using inaccurate rhetoric and deceptive euphemisms, such as representative government, consent of the governed, and the will of the people. The same goes for representative government. The claim is that the people, by electing certain individuals into positions of power, are choosing their leaders, and that those in office are merely representing the will of the people. A government cannot possibly represent the people as a whole unless everyone wants exactly the same thing, because different people want the government to do different things. The government will always be going against the will of at least some of the people. Even if a government did exactly what a majority of its subjects wanted, which never actually happens, it would not be serving the people as a whole, it would be forcibly victimizing smaller groups on behalf of larger groups. Furthermore, one who represents someone else cannot have more rights than the one he represents. Simply put, if one person has no right to break into his neighbor's house and steal his valuables, then he also has no right to designate a representative to do that for him. To represent someone is to act on his behalf, and a true representative can only do what the person he represents has the right to do. But in the case of governments, the people whom the politicians claim to represent have no right to do anything that politicians do, like impose taxes, enact laws, etc. Average citizens have no right to control the choices of their neighbors by force, tell them how to live their lives and take their money without their consent, and punish them if they disobey. So when a government does such things, it is not representing anything or anyone but itself. The fact that people already know that governments never represent them is demonstrated by the fact that the people, the ones they represent, never take any responsibility for the actions of their representatives. If their candidate of choice enacts a harmful law or raises taxes or wages war, the voters never feel the same guilt or shame they would feel if they themselves had personally done such things. You voted for that person to get into office so that he can impose his plan on everybody else. What if he actually wins and decides to do things that are immoral, like every politician does when he imposes his version of tax policy on your neighbor, or without mincing any words, steals your neighbor's money for whatever it is he wants to use it for? Would you be comfortable with saying that you stole your neighbor's money? Why not? If the politician you voted for is doing so on your behalf, aren't you the one forcing your neighbor to pay for something he doesn't want to pay for, and by doing so stealing from him? Well, no, the politicians are doing that, not me. This throws the concept of representative government right out the window. Would you force your neighbor to pay for the priorities, preferences, and programs that you wish for, and have men with guns kick down his door and take him away from his family if he doesn't pay for it? Or would you actually allow your neighbor to spend his own money on what he values? And if your answer is a no to the first question and a yes to the second question, then why do you vote? Because if you vote, then I assume that you know what you're voting for. You're voting for people to get into power and demand money from millions of people for whatever your party wants to do. You are voting people into power who are going to force me and many others to fund things that we might not want to fund. And if we don't want to give our money, which we gave our time, energy, and attention for in order to earn it, to the politician that you voted for, then you want his henchmen with guns to kick down our door and drag us away from our friends and family and lock us up in a cage for many years for refusing to fund whatever it is you voted for, even if you want to call that tax evasion or breaking the law. If you're truly honest with yourself, then at least be honest about what you want. And if you still vote for politicians, then that's exactly what you want. You want to force your will upon another, and you want people to be threatened with violence for not going along with it, which is the direct opposite of consent, and incidentally, the exact opposite of freedom. You are against freedom if you vote. Another idea that is often proclaimed by ardent believers in governments is that we are the government. I mean, if you cannot distinguish yourself, the victim of threats of violence, from the people threatening you, then you are severely indoctrinated. You've been trained not to see reality as it is. An example that Larken once gave is very appropriate. To say we are the government is exactly as rational as being accosted by a carjacker who demands that you give him your car under the threat of hurting you, letting him take your car and saying, as you see him drive off, "I am the carjacker." Surely nobody's insane enough to say that, but we are trained to believe that we are the government because we get to choose which puppet is going to tell us how we can live our lives, decide what we can or cannot do, and steal our money using threats of violence and call that freedom. What we also hear very often is that violent coercion and subjugation is justified for the good of society. Now suppose a ruler would enact a law that said that from now on everyone has to eat a healthy diet and exercise every day, and if you don't eat a healthy diet and exercise every day, he would force you to hand over a lot of money in the form of fines, or threaten to do violence unto you and put you in a cage. Now, it's for your own good, and you will actually benefit from it. Let's say that your health did actually improve over a certain period of time. Would that justify the ruler's violent behavior and the imposition of his dietary preferences on you? Does the end really justify the means? Is it okay to do those otherwise immoral things unto others because it benefits them? The primary reason why government of any kind is inherently illegitimate is because there is no exemption from morality. Whatever your conception of morality or of right and wrong behavior happens to be. For me, that is the non-aggression principle, which implies that you do no harm to another living being. It follows logically that if it's wrong for me to steal and attack, then it is also wrong for anyone else to steal and attack. It is a logical impossibility to say that certain people are exempt from that they do somehow have the right to steal, threaten, assault, murder, etc. Now, if you do believe that some people are exempt from morality and have the right to do things that would normally constitute criminal acts, such as stealing, assaulting, etc., I would like to hear from you how someone acquires such an exemption and suddenly manages to possess the right to do bad things because a large number of people or a majority want it to be so? By writing down on a piece of paper that you have the right to steal and attack? By changing the names? In short, to advocate the idea that there should be a government implies that certain people should be exempt from morality and that they should have the right to steal if they call it taxation and confiscation, and to assault people violently if they call it arresting. But if it's wrong for you to knock on your neighbor's door and threaten him to give you his money so you can fund an education system, then it's also wrong to vote for a government to do it for you in the form of taxation. If you're still having doubts, I would just like to ask you how that works. Is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate or give away to someone else the moral right to do something that none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? So if it's wrong for me to do something, could I let someone else do it for me? If I don't have the right to steal, can I then give someone else that right? If so, how? A lot of people care about the poor and want to help them. And I do too. A lot, in fact. Now, some people would hold charity events or organize door-to-door collections, asking people if they would like to donate to help the poor. and I'm all for that. And then there are a lot of people who would vote for someone else to threaten millions of people they don't know, not ask them, but force them to hand over money for something they think is admirable, even if it is actually good. Would you knock on the doors of millions of people and force them to hand over money by threatening them with violence if they didn't, so that you can give it to the poor? Now, if you wouldn't do that on your own, why would you vote for someone else to do that instead? Because you were taught that if you vote for somebody else to do it for you, it's okay, when it's not. A lot of people want to be protected from bad guys, whether it's local bad guys or foreign bad guys, and I agree, and I am all for that. Some people would propose to set up an organization that people can call whenever somebody is accosted by an attacker or a thief, so they can come and protect them. And that sounds good to me so far. And then there are a lot of people who want to tax or steal from millions of people to force them to hand over their money under the threat of putting them in a cage if they don't, in order to pay some people to stop other people from stealing from them. Or simply put, I want my neighbors robbed so that they can be protected from robbers. And again, if you wouldn't do that on your own, if you wouldn't go up to your neighbor and steal his money so that you can pay other people to protect your neighbor from people who want to steal his money, why would you vote for someone else to do that for you instead? We don't recognize the absolute insanity of that because we've been trained to view such things as legitimate, because we've been taught to use different words for it and believe in it, simply because politicians write things on a piece of paper and perform all kinds of pseudo-religious rituals inside of large, majestic buildings. The problem and the solution do not lie in Washington DC, or London, or The Hague, nor will they ever lie there. The problem and the solution are in the minds of billions of people, in their unfounded belief that certain people can have the right to do patently immoral things like stealing, assaulting, threatening, etc., as long as they call it the law and call themselves authority. I would also like to address the idea of a smaller government that only does things that are necessary, which is also known as minarchism. The case is exactly the same regardless of how minimal the coercive and wrongful actions happen to be. If it's wrong for you to knock on your neighbor's door and force him to give you $5 so that you can fund a police force or education system and threaten him with violence and lock him up in a cage if he doesn't give it to you, then it's also wrong to vote for a government to do it for you in the form of taxation, even if it's only $5. And that also goes for all the Libertarian Party voters out there. In voting, everyone spends enormous amounts of time, money, energy, and effort on it, only to see it fail over and over again. And then they try again next year, and the year after that, and hope endlessly for a politician to get into power who will give us freedom, while it does nothing other than legitimize the idea that you need someone else's permission to be free, and that the power to grant you that freedom is not yours, but theirs. Now, allow me to explain to you why you were taught to believe that democracy is the quintessence of society, and that democracy is the same as freedom. If 49% of the population wanted lower levels of taxation or wanted government to stop doing something they are against, but maintain their belief in authority, they could accomplish exactly nothing via democracy. On the other hand, if even 10% of the population wanted no taxation at all and had escaped the myth of authority, including the democratic kind, they could achieve their goal easily by mere non-compliance. Take the Netherlands for example. If 10% of Dutch taxpayers openly refused to cooperate with attempts by the government to extort them, the ruling class would be powerless to do anything about it, and it would quickly grind to a halt. In the Netherlands, there are approximately 60,000 law enforcers and 25,000 BOA's, or Special Investigating Officers. And those numbers are even decreasing today. It would be impossible for 85,000 government henchmen to rob 1.7 million people who felt no obligation to pay. In fact, it would be impossible for any agency to enforce any law that even a fraction of the public could disobey without feeling shame or guilt. Brute force alone could not achieve compliance. This is why they invented democracy. To trick you into believing that government can somehow be legitimate and necessary, and to trick you into the cul-de-sac of hoping that one day there will be a politician who will grant you your freedom, and will allow you to keep more of what you've earned, who will allow you to be free and will grant you the right to do things that you already have the right to do. That sounds exactly like the slaves hoping that one day there will be a slave master who will grant them freedom and will let them keep more of what they have produced. The reason why the two scenarios, our situation and the situation of the slaves, are exactly the same is because you still need the master's permission to be free. It is still up to the master to decide how free you may or may not be. It is still up to the master to decide how much you may keep of what you have earned. The decision is still his to make, and therefore he owns you, and you are still a slave. What if I told you that you already have the right to be free, and that those rights don't come from human beings, but are inherent to your very existence? What if I told you that nobody ever has the right to impose anything on you by force, and that your consent is always necessary, no matter if the majority wants you to do things despite of it? What if I told you that numbers do not alter morality, and that wrong stays wrong, no matter how hard everybody else wants it to be right? Has anybody ever told you that you own yourself, and that you're not beholden to some politician who wants to impose his will on you by force, with the only choice being which politician you want to impose their will on you? What if I told you that there was something other than the political right and the political left, and that life is much more than politics? What if I told you that you should be able to make your own decisions and spend your own money on the things you value? You might assume that I just don't want there to be a government, because I find it to be more preferable. But actually, the point is that government is a logical impossibility and does not actually exist. The notion of a government exists only in the minds of people. If I were to ask, where is the government? Most people will point to the building their government works from. So is the building the government? Most of you would probably say no. Well, what is it then? Is it the politicians who work from the building? If so, then correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't these politicians just humans, like you? If your answer is yes, then how is it that they are governments and you're not? You're both human. So in other words, the politicians are allowed to boss you around and make you do things that you don't want to do, and steal your money under the threat of violence, but you're not allowed to do that to them? I assume your answer is, well, no, because they would put us in a cage if we did that. So they're always allowed to boss you around and steal your money? No, they can't just walk up to me in the street and demand money from me. They can only do that when they're working for the government. So the politicians themselves aren't the government, they just work for the government. Yes. Well, what is it then? Can you point to it? What is this thing that can make a group of these politicians, who are just a bunch of humans, order everybody else around and steal people's money? Another reason why government authority is a complete illusion is because you cannot be forced to do something that goes against your own moral conscience. Now, I'm sure most of you can think of a law that conflicts with your moral conscience. Should you be forced to obey that law that goes against your own moral conscience? Or should you ignore and break that law because it goes against your own moral conscience? Surely there is physical ramifications for disobeying the politicians, which will likely result in violence from their end. But if you could get away with it, would you ignore and break that law? If so, then there are exceptions for following the law, right? And who makes those exceptions? You or the authorities? I'm pretty sure that'll be you, right? So then, it is not for the authority to determine whether you obey its whims, but you yourself. So your own discernment always stands above the law, and you decide when you abide by it or not. And that can only mean one thing. that law and authority, in fact, do not stand above your own moral conscience and judgment, and that they therefore possess no authority at all. If the authority depends on how many people adhere to it, then there is no authority at all. I am obligated to do what he says unless I choose not to. In that case, there is no moral obligation at all, and thus there is no such thing as government authority. The fact of the matter is that the entire idea of government is nothing more than a religion. It is purely based on fiction. If you subscribe to the idea of a government, you have a religion, even if you call yourself an atheist. Whoever coined the term statheist, I think it's more appropriate. You believe in a deity that you cannot point to, that has rights that nobody else has, that issues commands that it is a sin to disobey. A deity that should be obeyed without question, even when it forces you to do what you think is bad and makes you disregard your own conscience. So whenever people contemplate life without a supposed government and ask, well, how would that work without a government? Or how would this work without a government? It would be much clearer if we asked those questions plainly and specifically. How will we build the roads if some people don't have an exemption from morality? How will we care for the poor if we don't give a small group of people the right to steal our money, waste some of it, and give the remainder to the poor? How will we defend ourselves if we don't give a small group of people the right to boss us around and tell us what to do and assault us if we disobey? Is it really that hard to figure those things out? If people can invent very advanced things like a car, don't you think we're able to figure out how to build a flat surface on which cars can drive? I mean, the last time I checked, it wasn't the politicians who built the roads, it was companies who were paid with money that was stolen from us. Don't you think we're able to organize and use our own money to pay those companies ourselves so that they can build the roads without it being stolen from us? Is it really that difficult to figure out how you will be in charge of your own life without politicians forcing you to do things under the threat of brute violence, who will often force you to do things that you know are bad? Wouldn't it be much better if we could organize things together based on mutual consent? Imagine that you could fund whatever you wish to fund, instead of some politicians forcing you to pay for something you may not like wars and bailouts, and then bicker with each other over who should have the right to enforce his will on all of us. What if, instead, we all work together as responsible individuals and respect each other's free will? Do you really think that human beings are better off if they don't use their own judgment, free will, and conscience, and instead have to act, think, and behave according to how some politician wants them to act, think, and behave at any given time, and essentially be the robot of somebody else, with the only possible choice being which person may pull those strings on people's behavior? It is time to let go of the superstition that has kept us in a perpetual cycle of tyranny, oppression, and suffering. The problem doesn't lie with the person sitting on the throne that magically grants him the right to do inherently immoral things, such as stealing, assaulting, threatening, and kidnapping. But it should be obvious that the throne itself is the problem, because such rights simply don't exist, and nobody ever has the right to commit such acts of aggression when other people cannot. No matter what you scribble on a piece of paper, what names you replace the acts with, or how many people want it to be so. And who do you think is going to be the most eager to get his hands on such right and power that people will imagine him to have? Peaceful people who live and let live, or narcissistic, power-hungry individuals who want to rule and control other people's lives? By now, you will hopefully understand why we continue to end up in this situation as a species. Coercion and violence can never create peace and freedom. How do you attempt to achieve freedom with the very actions that violate freedom? The difference between having a government and having no government is that in the absence of a government, no one will force you to do anything against your will and call you the bad guy for not complying, and have everybody else believe him and think it's okay for him to do so. What do you prefer? A world where your consent matters? And I'm talking about real consent, real mutual agreements, and where you can decide what you do and spend your resources on? Or would you prefer a world where you are governed, where your consent doesn't matter, and where some other person may decide how you should live your own life, until he lets you do things that you know are wrong? And the only choice you'll have is to decide which ruler may now claim that seat of power over your life, in the hopes that one day you'll have a master that will grant you more freedom. If that is your definition of freedom, then you are a slave who's waiting for something to be what it never was and never will be. Your masters have convinced you that your servitude is your freedom, because you're allowed to choose which master you will serve. They've just given it a different name, and that name is democracy. They say that your vote is your voice. It appears the irony speaks for itself. True freedom is based on consent. True freedom is voluntary, and above all, with true freedom, everybody is truly equal, and nobody has rights that nobody else has. If you want to know more about self-ownership, voluntary coexistence, and a life without rulership, then I would encourage you to watch my other videos. Discover the true meaning of freedom, and learn things that nobody will tell you. Thank you for watching. Until next time.